In this video, I'm going to be identifying 10 of my favorite red Bordeaux for $75 or less. These will be something of a mixed bag, some from the left bank, others from the right bank. Some of these names will likely be familiar to you, where others are likely a bit under the radar and are some names you may not have heard previously. For some of you, these could be cellar defenders. For others, they could be aspirational wines that you look forward to enjoying on special occasions. But regardless of your financial circumstances, I think these are all outstanding wines for $75 or less. A couple of them are even closer to $60, so I hope that you will all enjoy these wines as much as I do. Chateau Braun is the first of my favorite Bordeaux for $75 or less. And just to be clear, this is a different producer than Chateau Braun that I've mentioned previously. Chateau Braun is a second growth in the 1855 classification, and it's from Margaux. As with some other Margaux, this particular producer's wines are characterized by elegance and finesse. This producer made substantial improvements in their vineyards that began to pay off beginning with the 2009 vintage. They've had a particularly strong string since 2015 and continuing through 2020. 2017 is just a step below some of those others, but otherwise they've been extremely consistent and impressive beginning with 2015. The vineyards are planted to 55% Cabernet Sauvignon, 40% Merlot, 4.5% Cab Franc, and they even have 0.5% of Carmenere that they've been adding to the wines, which is kind of interesting. These are definitely wines that you can enjoy young. However, if you do that, you're going to be missing out on some of the complexity that they can gain with some age. I highly recommend it, especially if you can find them from 2015 through 2019. This is definitely one that I think you will enjoy, and one which is a compelling value for $75 or less. The next of my favorite Bordeaux for $75 or less is Domaine de Chevalier. Domaine de Chevalier is a classified producer in the Graves classification, and it's located in Pessac, Léognan. This is a producer that's making highly acclaimed wines for a number of recent vintages. As with most producers, it's a safe bet to buy 2009, 2010, and 2015 through 2020. They use sustainable farming methods. Their vineyards are planted to 63% Cabernet Sauvignon, 30% Merlot, 5% Petit Verdot, and 2% Cabernet Franc. I recently saw the 2019 vintage selling for about $69, which is an excellent price for a wine of this quality. Le Petit Lion from Chateau Léoville-Lescasse is my next favorite Bordeaux for $75 or less. This is the second wine from famed producer Léoville-Lescasse. This is a wine that's been sold since 2007. This wine started after Léoville-Lescasse replanted a number of the vines that had previously gone into the top Léoville-Lescasse wine. In addition, Lescasse adds a number of the Bordeaux grapes that used to go into the top wine. Merlot ripens earlier than either Cab Franc or Cabernet Sauvignon, and before we had this string of consistently ripe vintages in Bordeaux, Lescasse would oftentimes need to use that Merlot in the blend for the top wine to help soften the Cabernet Sauvignon and Cab Franc if they were required to pick those grapes earlier than ideal. Given the significant amount of Merlot in this wine, this is one that you can actually enjoy early on and is approachable when it's fairly young. That's somewhat surprising given how structured and tannic Lescasse can be, but it's definitely the case with this wine. The 2018 Léoville-Lescasse is a 100-point wine, and yet this second wine from Léoville-Lescasse can be had for around $69 a bottle. I've also seen the 2020 futures for around $65 a bottle. So it's definitely an excellent buy year in and year out, and so if you can find this one, I would definitely not hesitate to purchase it. Chateau Feite Kleine is the next of my favorite Bordeaux for $75 or less. This is an extremely small producer in Palmeira. So it's located on the right bank. As I mentioned, it's a very small estate. There's only about 7 hectares of vines. 90% is planted to Merlot and 10% is planted to Cabernet Franc. They only produce about 1,200 to 1,500 cases a year, and this one is definitely priced very, very reasonably because there's not very many people who have heard of it before. The quality has been outstanding, especially since 2015, and the 2020 vintage may be their very best effort to date. The next of my favorite Bordeaux for $75 or less is a third classified growth from the 1855 classification from Margaux, namely Chteau Giscourt. Chteau Giscourt was in rough shape in the mid-1990s, but they made substantial investments and improvements in the vineyards. Among other things, they heavily increased the percentage of Cabernet Sauvignon and reduced the percentage of Merlot. They also replanted more than 130,000 vines, and they began to harvest manually rather than using mechanized or machine methods to harvest their grapes. These efforts resulted in substantial improvements and began paying dividends as early as the 2000 vintage. The vineyards are currently planted to about 65% Cabernet Sauvignon and 30% Merlot. Since these improvements took effect, Chteau Giscourt has been producing some outstanding wines. Particularly strong vintages include 2009, 2010, and the string of vintages beginning in 2015. This is definitely a consistently excellent producer that flies under the radar in most vintages, and which I highly recommend if you can find it for $75 or less per bottle. I recently spotted the 2020 futures for only $62 a bottle, so this one is quite a bit below the $75 threshold. The next of my favorite Bordeaux for $75 or less per bottle is from the right bank in Saint-Emilion, namely Chteau La Caflier. The Chteau La Caflier vineyards are planted to about 63% Merlot and 37% Cabernet Franc. 2018 was an exceptional vintage for this producer and received a 99-point score from at least one well-known critic. The 2019 is also an outstanding vintage. While these back vintages may cost a little more than $75, they're outstanding and worth a bit of a reach, but you can definitely get the 2020 futures for $75 or less per bottle. The next of my favorite Bordeaux for $75 or less per bottle comes from Saint Julien on the left bank of Bordeaux. Saint Julien used to be one of my favorite and most consistently reliable sources for value in Bordeaux. However, many of my favorite producers that I've been purchasing for years have experienced substantial run-ups in prices lately, and it's getting more and more difficult to find top Saint Julien for reasonable prices. So you may want to keep an eye out for Chteau St Pierre. Chteau St Pierre is a fourth growth in the 1855 classification of Bordeaux. It's the smallest classified producer in Saint Julien. They have only about 17 hectares, which is quite small by Saint Julien standards. The vineyards are planted to 75% Cabernet Sauvignon, 15% Merlot, and 10% Cabernet Franc. The closest other Saint Julien producers to Chteau St Pierre are Baisheville and de Cru-Bucaille. 2016, 2018, 2019, and 2020 are all excellent, and I would highly recommend them if you could find them for $75 or less. You should be able to do so because this is another one where the 2020 futures are selling for closer to $60 than $70. And in fact, I found the 2020 futures for $60, I found some 2019 for $65, and some 2018 for $70. So these are all excellent buys and wines that I think you'll be very happy with. A Margaux wine is my next favorite Bordeaux for $75 or less per bottle, specifically Alter Ego from Chteau Palmeira. This wine is a second label, not a second wine. By that, I mean that specific plots typically go into this wine every year. This is not just declassified wine or wine from young vines that doesn't make it into the top bottling. This is a wine that Chteau Palmeira has been producing since around 1998. It offers consistently high quality year in and year out. It's definitely one that will age very well. The 2010 that I had about a year ago was showing extremely well, for example, but it's also one that will show nicely even in its youth, especially with a little bit of air on it. Especially now that Chteau Palmeira has been rising in price lately, this is definitely a good opportunity to be able to get some of that house style and the elegance that I enjoy so much with Chteau Palmeira. The 2020 futures are available for around $76, $77 a bottle, which is definitely worth it in my view, considering the fact that this wine normally sells for $100 or more. I'm a huge fan of Palmeira from Bordeaux's right bank, but it can be extremely expensive, and so I'm very excited to be able to identify another Palmeira producer as my next favorite Bordeaux for $75 or less per bottle, specifically Chteau Nan. This is another turnaround story. About 7 to 8 years ago, Chteau Nan began to make a number of improvements in the vineyards, such as lowering yields, among other things. It takes some time for these initiatives to work their way into the finished product, and even longer for the market to become aware of the increase in quality. That gives collectors and purchasers an opportunity to purchase this wine and some of the others that I'm discussing here today for prices that are low relative to the quality. While Palmeira wines can be silky and elegant, this one does have a bit more structure than many wines from Palmeira. The vineyard is planted to about 78% Merlot and 21% Cab Franc with 1% Cabernet Sauvignon. The 2019 and 2020 vintages in particular are two of the strongest vintages ever from this producer and are well worth seeking out for $75 or less per bottle. Chteau Lynchbage and Chteau Palmeira from Pauillac are two of my favorite producers, and so it's no surprise that my next favorite Bordeaux for $75 or less per bottle is neighbors with those two outstanding producers. Specifically, I'm talking about a fifth growth from the classification of 1855, namely Chteau Granpuis Lacoste. As a left bank producer, its wines are Cabernet Sauvignon dominant, and the vineyards are planted to 75% Cabernet Sauvignon, 20% Merlot, and 5% Cabernet Franc. This is a classic and age-worthy wine that's been on a hot streak. As with many producers, the 2009, 2010, and 2015 through 2020 vintages are all worth seeking out, and this one is generally available for $75 or less per bottle. In top vintages, it can even rival some second growths, so it's definitely one that I think you'll enjoy. Many of the wines I've discussed in this video are from the 2020 vintage in Bordeaux. So if you're interested in more information about that vintage, make sure to check the links below where I've provided a link to a vintage review that I did for the 2020 vintage in Bordeaux.